All right, y'all. So welcome to another episode of Full Circle Podcast. I'm your host, Joseph. And today we are going to be talking about a topic that has been all in the headlines and has probably been something that I feel like this is a topic that should be more talked about, at least at length and in depth. But it's a topic of immigration. And I've heard a lot of narratives. I've heard a lot of conversations. Obviously, we are in Trump 2.0 right now. That's just what it is. A lot more to come as we talk about some of those things regarding, the future and how that's going to look for a lot of us, especially those that have been reading about the tariffs and everything that's coming through. But today, I want us to really talk about immigration and to look at it from a holistic point of view. Essentially, this conversation is as old as the United States itself. But it's not just about, borders and policies. This is a conversation about labor. This is a conversation about exploitation. And frankly, this is truly a conversation about how do we move forward when so much of what has happened in this country has been exploitative, it has been damaging, and it, in many ways, has been a unjust narrative and a false choice narrative. And so here we're just going to do a little bit of digging, talking about how immigration policy has evolved from the 20th century to today, and how, of course, economic problems, catastrophes, corporate interest, and political rhetoric and campaign communication has shaped literally the lives of millions of people who are being affected by this everywhere. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk about the humanitarian and the economic contributions of immigrants to this country. We're going to break down some facts and myths. We're going to talk about the most common myths surrounding immigration. And most importantly, we're going to talk about solutions, because to be quite honest, this whole conversation has been rife with a lack of facts. It's been rife with dishonesty. It's been rife with a lot of emotional narratives or anecdotes. And don't get me wrong, anecdotes are important. Stories about how people's lives have been affected, people that have lost their lives or their loved ones due to crime, right? From, if there are people that have entered the country illegally and they do commit a crime, a lot of times that becomes more part of the narrative than the actual statistical fact of what's happening. And those stories aren't unimportant. They're not without merit. But I really want us to look at this situation and talk about it with fairness, because we're talking about human lives here. And we're talking about human lives that, so much of us are so far from the immigration conversation. I mean, unless you live on the border, or if you're, a family member of someone who's dealing with this, or you might be listening to this today and this is directly affecting you. It is important that we have a nuanced conversation about the impacts of this, talking about it, talking about the blacks, the whites, and the grays of this narrative. And also now being able to say, how do we in this time and in this generation move forward and talk about this with some actual empathy, compassion, legality, and also, essentially, like, how do we talk about it from an ethical standpoint? How do we do this the right way? So I want to do that. What I want to do is, obviously, if you have been paying attention to politics, even if you have not, you are no stranger to Donald Trump. Clearly. Here's how all this stuff started, at least in the last, I would say the last 12 years. A lot of these narratives, here's how a lot of these narratives have kind of come back up to the public light. If you're somebody who's really tuned into politics, you're very familiar with this. This is not new. And I'm going to go ahead and play this. I'm going to play this clip in a second. Before I do that, if you have not subscribed to us on YouTube, if you have not followed us on social media, or if you have not subscribed to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening, go ahead and do that right now. Smash that button. Go ahead and follow us at _Full Circle Pod on Instagram, and it's Full Circle Pod on TikTok. So we're going to keep this going and run it up. Also, very, very quickly, I want to shout out my boy, Saran Francis Yazel. I'm going to go ahead and add that like it's like a designer brand, Francis Yazel. Go ahead and check his brand out on Instagram as well. I think it's really, really dope. I love some of these hats. You can get them in multiple colors. And no, he's not sponsoring me yet. I'm just giving a shout out because I think these hats are super fire. Check out that love heart on the side right there. I just think it's cool. And listen, if you get this hat, you check it out. Listen, if your shorty don't like the hat, she probably whack. Okay. So let's go ahead. Let's dive right into it. For many people, as I mentioned before, this is the quote that started off a lot of fire and has brought this back into our recent political discussions. And I'm going to go ahead and play this for y'all really quickly. This one. Here we go.
U.S. has become a dumping ground for everybody else's problems.
First of all, the way this guy communicates, like, here's the thing. There's a difference between an eloquent communicator and an effective communicator. Love or hate this guy, which if anybody knows me very, very well, I did not support Donald Trump in his first or second campaign. And I have a lot of issues with the way that he handles things. Now, I will just say this. I'm a person, I want our whole country to win, and I want our world to be safe. If Donald Trump does something that is good, I'm going to say, listen, bro did a good job in this area, as I would with any president. However, more times than not, I vehemently disagree with the way that he communicates, the blanket statements that he makes about a group of people. And just frankly, we have a lot of problems. We have so many people that are coming into our country. It's a terrible thing. I mean, like, you put a bunch of people on there, and I often like to, do like impersonations of presidents and different people. But obviously, if this whole thing was like a joke, like if this was a TV show or a scripted thing, I think we would all be laughing, and this would be like, wow, hilarious television. The problem is this dude is serious, and we've just continued to see that. He'll just double down on it. But this is where a lot of the narrative started. So here we go.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best.
This is where the problem
They're not
is.
sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending...
Dude just pointing at random people in the crowd. Just not sending you and you. Like there were two Mexicans planted in. Just so random. Very strange, very strange.
People that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime. They're rapists. And some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards, and they tell us what we're getting.
So here's the issue with this narrative. And I just want to put this out here, okay? This narrative, say whatever you want. People can say, oh, they took him out of context, everything like that. But when you make the statement, when Mexico sends its people, first of all, that's just ridiculous. A country's not sending people. That's number one. Now, you can say that, oh, that's not a literal statement that he was saying. He was kind of saying when people come through, whatever. That's the first part. When you say they're not sending their best, that means that the best people from that country are not coming in. And then, of course, what happens? We go straight to the crime. We go straight to drugs. We go straight to what he said about, that whole narrative, rapist, whatever. This is something that I want to tackle in our conversation today, because this narrative about Mexicans specifically in this country and labor and the changing demographics is something that you have to really understand the past to really have a educated conversation today about this. So one thing I really want to look at, first of all, let's kind of start with where we're at right now in terms of how many people that are undocumented in the country. And that's not just the targeted demographic, which a lot of people love to talk about, Mexicans, right? Or Latino people. 11 million people currently that are undocumented are in the United States today. Now, that number could be different. That number might be statistically different. But right now, according to Pew Research Center, there are 11 million undocumented immigrants that live in the United States today. Now, you might look at this and say, okay, how did this happen? How has this become a thing? We're going to dive into that because there have been U.S. policies that have both welcomed and have exploited these people that are undocumented in the country. So how do we figure that out? What I want to do is start with the early 20th century. Okay. Now you might look at this and we can go all the way, back to, the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I will talk about a little bit towards the end here. But before we even talk about the early 20th century, let's just get this statement out of the way. The United States was founded on illegal immigration. Now, you might listen to this and you might say, oh my God, Joseph, I can't believe you said that. That's an outrageous statement. That's un-American. It's true. Deal with it. It's true. There were over 50 million indigenous Americans living in this country or on this piece of land because it wasn't a country at the time. And they occupied everything from the West Coast all the way over to the East Coast and up and down and in between. And these people, many of these tribes, they're of course living off the land. And to escape, because to have a conversation about this in fairness and with understanding of where we are right now, the very way that this country was founded and even created was based off of people trying to escape their own government's oppression for their right to exercise their religious liberty. So how do you go from escaping religious and political persecution to then come to a country or a piece of land that is not your own? You meet indigenous Americans who are the real true Americans in the sense that they were the ones here first. And they teach you how to farm. They teach you how to grow produce that you've never seen before, corn. I mean, just a variety of different things. And they take you in. Now, obviously, there was, history of hostilities between Europeans. And of course, we would think so, because if anybody came on your land and you didn't know who they were, you had never seen them a day in your life, would you just welcome those people coming in? And they were posing a threat. They weren't just coming in and working and supporting and trying to get along, but they're now bringing weapons and ships and everything like that. And now they're homesteading and they're cutting down trees and they're taking over. And now they're pushing you further because that's what happened. How is it that it went from 50 plus million indigenous peoples to what the U.S. Census, according to some of these numbers here, is down to 250,000 or more people? I'm not even going to start on that. That's a whole different conversation about genocide and about how we've gotten to where we are and how that hasn't even been addressed historically. But that's what we're looking at here. And so this country, you come in, you establish 13 colonies. You talk about oppression coming from a foreign power that helped establish these colonies. You declare independence. And with that being said, now you continue to move your way westward and north and southward until you have practically eliminated an entire people group. For us to have a real conversation about this, we have to land on the fact that that is how this began. And I think until we're truly honest about that, we're never going to be able to actually reckon with where we are right now. So that's just a starting point. I won't even go any deeper into that. If you don't like it, I'm sorry, but it's a fact. Moving forward, if we look at the early 20th century, the place where a lot of this vitriol and hatred and negativity in policy, not just in rhetoric, towards Mexican people really became part of American law was in the early 20th century during the Great Depression. And this was known as an act called Mexican Repatriation, the Mexican Repatriation Act. Now, a lot of people don't really know much about this. It's not something that's commonly talked about, but this is going to help to set the stage for you to understand why the rhetoric is what it is. And during this period of time, which was from 1929 to 1939, 1 million Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals were deported from this country. Now, here's the crazy part. Over 60% of these people that were deported were actually U.S. citizens. That is more than half. So this country used the Great Depression and the economic downturn, and they started using the rhetoric, essentially scapegoating, to say, look at these people. They're taking your jobs. They're taking your livelihoods. And this rhetoric was used to support the deportation of Mexicans in this country. And many of these people didn't even live in Mexico before. They were literally, their families may have come here, or after the Mexican-American War, they were living here because, remember, the United States purchased Mexico or purchased California and Arizona and some of those other countries in the Southwest as part of the the end of the Mexican-American War. And so there were people that were literally living here. They were citizens, that their land and property had been passed down through their families. And if these people appeared to be Mexican, some of them weren't even, some of them had no Mexican heritage, they were sent to Mexico. There's an article about this called The Forgotten History of Mexican Repatriation by NPR. If you want to look it up, I'm going to be naming some articles so y'all can actually look up this information and do your own research about this. But the crazy part about this is that local governments and private citizens were even utilized to pressure Mexican families to self-deport. And there were mass arrests that were specifically targeting those in Latino communities. So the crazy part about this is that today, of course, we hear about some of these similar narratives. The Remain in Mexico policy under the Trump administration, during the first administration, which, asylum seekers are in these situations. They're trying to get asylum in the United States, which Trump seems to confuse seeking asylum often with coming from a mental institution or an insane asylum. I don't know why, but I hear that oftentimes in quotes that he will use. And the thing about this is that the Remain in Mexico policy, it actually forces asylum seekers to wait in dangerous conditions south of the border while they're trying to get out. Now, we can talk about Mexico and Mexico's responsibility in terms of, their country and trying to make things more safe for their own people. But there are a lot of elements that the United States has played a part in historically, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So the United States during this period of time, 1929 to 1939, was actively engaged in the deportation of over 1 million Mexican people, Mexican Americans or Mexican nationals. Over 60% of them were U.S. citizens. So How do we get to a shift in that policy? Well, in the middle of the 20th century, literally, this was not even, if this ended in 1939, right? You have 3 years now in between this from 1939 to 1942, where a year prior to 42, the United States goes ahead and gets involved in World War II. For the entire time, Franklin Roosevelt had said, we're not going to get involved in the war. We're not going to, we're not going to subject ourselves to this. We're going to largely stay out of the conflict. And of course, European allies were begging the United States, please help us get involved. Sound familiar, Ukraine? And so basically the United States stayed out of that process for a few years. But how do you fix an economic downturn in any situation? If you're in the middle of war, or if you're in the middle of crisis economically, or if you're in the middle of shortages in production, what's one way to fix that? Get involved in a war. Now, I'm not necessarily saying that was the motivation, because some things are not necessarily because of, some things are in spite of. So I want to make sure that there's a clear distinction. I'm not pro conspiracy theory, although I will say that a lot of things that we're beginning to find out as we're doing more research and, files are getting declassified and whatnot, some of the things that people have been called crazy about and have said, or people have said they're conspiracies, have turned out to have either complete fact or some merit behind them. So I think it's very, very important that, once again, do your research. That's why I'm providing you guys with articles and links that you can go and look into about these topics, because I do want to say this before I continue. Right now, so many people are going to TikTok and Instagram and sound bites and quick little videos to find their information. And you think you become an expert, excuse me, you think you become an expert by watching this content or listening to it or really going to the comments. But I do believe it's important that if we're going to come to the table and have nuanced conversations about this and really be leaders in our society and actually try to fix a problem, we need to stop being clip activists. We need to stop being weekend warriors when it comes to looking into facts and then contributing to them. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use your voice, but I'm saying that because in the age of AI and in the age of a lot of information that's getting mixed up out there, anybody can drop a video and they can say something that sounds good, but it doesn't have facts behind it, or it doesn't offer the full context. And that's why, I don't want to contribute to that today. And that's why I'm taking the time to really go through this so y'all have an understanding of how we got here. So I would really encourage you, please look into everything, do your research, and let's speak with some conviction and facts. Okay. So continuing onward, during this period of time, of course, the United States, due to the draft, they had a labor shortage. And so the U.S. government launched the Bracero program. Okay. That's not even talking about the mass entrance of women who had been largely, kept out of the workforce due to a lot of policies that, if we're really just being straight up honest about it, it's not even a complicated thing. It was misogynistic. They kept women out of the workforce. So you have all of these situations. You have women entering the workforce in mass. You have, the country now shifting over into, trying to fight this war effectively. And the United States launches the Bracero program that brought millions of Mexican workers to the United States between 1942 and 1964. So this went from a year, well, not even a year, probably months after, because December 7th, 1941 was Pearl Harbor. So that following year, 1942, all the way to 1964, okay, you have a massive expansion of Mexicans in the labor force in the United States. On paper, And verbally, the government communicated as, listen, here's a win-win. Y'all get jobs, we get workers, and we can help to stimulate the economy. But here's the problem. During this period of time, this program was full of exploitative measures where you have workers that have poor wages. They're not being paid a fair wage for their work. There were harsh labor conditions, and there were a lack of legal protections. Okay. So at the end of the day, one thing to keep in mind here, and once again, if you want to know more about this, you can look at this article called The Bracero Program, How U.S. Farm Labor Exploitation Shape Immigration Policy on history.com. 4.6 million, over 4.6 million Mexican workers participated, but many were treated as disposable labor. They're not getting paid a fair wage. They're being subjugated to harsh conditions because they're not citizens. So they technically are not, guaranteed the same conditions, pay, and protections as a U.S. citizen, but they're helping to build the country's economy. The interesting thing about this is that this policy and this framework has set the ground for essentially modern reliance on the undocumented labor. And even though this program ended, of course, in 1964, and I know some of y'all might be listening saying, well, that program ended in 1964. So what's going on, right? What people don't understand is that many of these workers stayed. And then, of course, they had families. And those, obviously these people, they were still unauthorized, but they were essential. They have become essential to everything from construction to hospitality to agriculture. And why this is important to know is because there has been this consistent tension, especially in times where the United States has experienced prosperity, between needing immigrant labor and refusing to protect immigrant rights, all at the same time when we experience an economic downturn. There is a blaming for those same positions that most Americans are not going to work unless they have a proper wage, a livable wage, and fair conditions. Those same people that have been working in these jobs faithfully oftentimes start at the very, very bottom, getting paid pennies on the dollar, and then work their way up. Those very same people are being called lazy. Those very same people are being called criminals. Those very same people, the narrative is that they're leeching off of the welfare system. These are narratives. And these narratives don't line up with history. This is a consistent theme that we're going to see over and over and over again as we're having this conversation. Here's the most important part about this. And this is a paradox that for me, as a student of history, going to school for political science, studying American history and global history, and also the United States history with Central and South America, Latin America, really, if you want to talk about it at large. In the United States, there has been a political barrage against illegal immigration. But the United States economy has relied and frankly has thrived off of undocumented labor. I mean, you've got immigrants, documented and undocumented, that currently make up 17%. This is just a fact. Currently, they make up 17% of the United States workforce and are essential to industries like agriculture, construction, and hospitality. Now, this is an article, once again, if you guys want to know more about this article is called the, quote, Economic Impact of Immigrants in the United States by the Brookings Institute. And this gives you an entire list of statistics where you can actually see how this has happened over the years and today. But the interesting part about this is that, and here's a really big myth that we hear all the time. You've probably heard this. People say, oh, look at all these people. They're crossing the border. They're coming into our country. We don't know where they're coming from. All this other stuff. Like, these people just keep crossing the border illegally. But the true fact about this is most people that come into this country that are undocumented don't come over the border. That might be shocking to hear if you are constantly, looped in through the machine that's pumping out this information, largely conservative outlets. And listen, I'll just say this. I'm an independent, politically and in life. I am not somebody that is like, oh, well, everything conservative is bad and everything that is liberal is bad or progressive or whatever. I can tell you what I don't support. I don't support lies. I don't support fascism. I don't support a lack of empathy in how we handle these situations, especially given our abuses historically in this country. And what I don't support is this concerted effort to divide. And that's on both sides of the spectrum. But specifically in recent years, I have seen it in the narratives that have come out of the Republican Party and the Trump campaign and administration. And it is absolutely egregious to me that what we would do in this country is try to elevate narratives and nationalism over honesty and empathy. Because we have to have an honest conversation about how we got here and real solutions to fix this problem. And if we're using false narratives to then present solutions, we're just going to continue to repeat the same cycle. The most important fact to note here is that instead of these people crossing the border, right, which is typically the narrative we hear, most people are actually just overstaying visas. This is according to the Cato Institute. Visa overstays account for 2/3 of the undocumented population. So why, you might ask yourself, if that's the case, Joseph, okay, like I'm going to take what you're saying. I'm going to look at these articles. If that's the case, like, why is there a reluctance? Why is there a pushback or a hesitation to create pathways to legal status for these workers? And if we're just being honest, the answer really lies with, once again, with a mix of politics, it's economics, and some of it has to do with racist ideologies. Now, I know some of you guys are out there like, oh my gosh, like, some people say not everything is racist. I agree with that. I believe not everything is racist, but we need to have a real conversation about what racism is and how it has impacted the way we're moving. Because for us to act like we're not dealing with some of these things systemically and otherwise, at this point, you're just a fool. If you are willing to turn a blind eye to look at the facts of what is happening and historically what has happened from an exploitation standpoint, from a political standpoint, and really from a trying to preserve a majority, because, and we'll get to that later, but white people are losing the majority in America in terms of you're just strictly, we're turning more into a mixed country in terms of culturally speaking. We are moving in that direction. We are a more culturally diverse, racially diverse country than we ever have been historically. And some people don't like that. And that's where you hear some of these old narratives, these old tropes, these old ideas that really propagate either white supremacist narratives or this old sense of what an American means. There's true Americans and then there's other Americans. And that's just something we have to look at, in fact. Carrying on from here, I want to talk about this because now we're going to talk about everything from the 1980s moving forward. So this might seem a little bit confusing that, okay, like Mexicans have been let into the country or they've been pushed out of the country and then brought back to come and work and kind of they're being exploited. What are we doing, right? Well, during the Reagan administration, which this might seem very confusing because Trump likes to kind of align himself with Reagan, right? In the weirdest sense of the word. And I'm not a Reagan specific fan by any stretch of the imagination. I think he did a lot of things, especially post the civil rights era, that were very harmful, especially to the Black and Latino community in America. But There were things that he did do that I guarantee you, if he were alive today and was looking at what Trump is doing and has done, I think he would literally be disgusted. And I think even the Republican Party, in many ways, of 10, 15, 20 years ago, would look at what's happening right now, and they would completely not even recognize, past Republican presidents would not even recognize what's happening in this administration and in this time. It's a complete capitulation to and surrender to this administration. And we have to talk about that, how we got here from that point, because it stands starkly in contrast with really the trajectory the United States has been on as of the last, I would say, 20 to 25 years. But back to the Reagan administration. In the 1980s, there was a policy called the Immigration Reform and Control Act, and it had two important provisions in it that stood out. It legalized 3 million undocumented immigrants that had been in the United States. Now, y'all might say, "Whoa, slow down. That sounds like a Democratic policy. Like that sounds like a liberal policy." That was Ronald Reagan in 1986. And what it did was, at the same time, while it did legalize 3 million undocumented immigrants who had been in the U.S. since 1982, it also strengthened employer sanctions to prevent the hiring of undocumented workers. So it's like, okay, wait a minute. On the surface, yeah, this kind of seems like a balanced approach, right? But here's the thing. You're telling people in one sense, hey, you're here, and we're going to, we're going to give you citizenship, essentially, or in some way create a legality for you. But then on the other hand, we're going to create sanctions on employers that would hire undocumented workers. And here's where it gets tricky, because while this seems like it's a balanced approach, this policy began to criminalize unauthorized entry into the United States. And this is essentially where this narrative about the enforcement part, right? Because if you really look at it, the United States we didn't really talk about borders. That whole border conversation didn't really come up until Mexican repatriation. And then it got steeper and steeper as we got deeper into the 80s. And of course, the Clinton administration, which is next up. That's when the conversation about borders and enforcing border, patrol and security really started coming to the forefront. But why this is really, really interesting is because even despite this law, the undocumented population is reported to have grown from 3 million in 1986 to over 11 million by 2010. Now, you might ask yourself, why did this happen? How is this even possible? And the reason that this happened is because while politicians were verbally saying they were going to crack down on illegal immigration, at the same time, the U.S. economy and corporations began to not only encourage this type of work, but they thrived off of it in two fashions. The first fashion was the outsourcing of work, the outsourcing of labor to foreign countries. Specifically, if we were going to talk about Mexico, maquiladoras, okay? So if you're wondering what a maquiladora is essentially a factory in Mexico. A foreign country or a corporation will then take their company, right? They want to build a factory. So instead of having it in the United States where there's more regulation and there are, obviously there's higher oversight, all this other stuff, and it costs more to do in the United States just because of the fact that you've got to pay people a fair wage. You've got to also make sure that there's, things are being handled properly. You can make more profit, a lot more profit, by taking that exact same factory, and instead of building it in the US, you can build it overseas. You can create jobs. You can strike a deal with that government and create jobs while at the same time, you don't have to pay people a fair wage. and you don't have to make sure that their conditions are proper. You can even have children working in these conditions, in these terrible, disgusting, unfair, unsanitary labor conditions. And you can literally pay these people pennies on the dollar while at the same time making maximum profit. That's example number one. Number two, you can have people here in the United States. They're desperate for a job. They're desperate for employment. And you can pay them under the table cash. Now, how does this work? You don't have to report these earnings necessarily, at least at the time specifically. You don't have to report these earnings. Because if you're paying people in cash, you can fudge numbers. And you know these people, you're working off of a desperation system, which really, if we're looking at it, a lot of this immigration conversation is based off of desperation. These people are not just like, oh, let me come to America and just kind of hang out and it'll be kind of nice. Do you realize how difficult it is when we live here? If you live here, if you live in Europe or somewhere else, and you're like, I want to go and move to another country. It's complicated to even make that move a reality, much less think about it. So do you know how desperate you have to be? How concerned you are for your family's life and future that you would literally upend everything and move your entire family, or try to make a move to come to this country, or even separate yourself from your family to come here and try to make a better life. And so when you're in that position of desperation, these corporations would take full advantage, and in many ways still do take advantage of the desperate labor market. And it's a win-win. And so, of course, during the Clinton administration, immigration, that's when we began to see more strict policies. The Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act expanded deportation grounds. And you, of course, can read more about this if you even go look up Bill Clinton and immigration. Here are some numbers that you'll see, or Bill Clinton Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act. The provisions of this law, it expanded deportation grounds and imposed criminal penalties for immigration violations. So up until this point, that had not happened. It was essentially like, this is almost like we're not strictly enforcing, we're just putting it out there as a law. But of course, corporations and the U.S. economy is benefiting from it while politicians are still speaking out against it. But during the Clinton administration, this law increased border patrols, it expedited deportations, it put restrictions on welfare access for immigrants, and it made it harder for undocumented immigrants to seek asylum. So as we're looking at here, there's just been a seesaw. It's like, okay, first you don't want us, then you want us, but you treat us terribly. Then you go ahead and you give us this protection and are loosely enforcing the law. And then all of a sudden there becomes this strict enforcement. At the end of Bill Clinton's presidency, deportations had risen to around 400,000 annually. And even while they were enforcing all this is the key part to look at, undocumented workers were still remaining integral to the United States economy. And once again, this is a paradox we're talking about, this contradiction almost. You're claiming to need immigrant labor, but at the same time punishing it. It's a consistent narrative. And that's when we start seeing the quotes like from George Bush, which I'm not sure if he was the first person to say this, but this has been a consistent theme. You've seen it, President Obama has made this statement, so on and so forth. We are a nation of immigrants, but we also have to be a nation of laws. This is a consistent theme that you're going to see politically. And the thing about the Bush administration that made this so different was that after 9/11, immigration became linked to national security. Now, of course, a lot of that was directed at Islam and of course, combining and conflating that with terrorism. But the Department of Homeland Security that was made a year after 9/11 or the year following 9/11 basically acted as a central organization to enforce immigration and have it under ICE and Border Patrol. So it centralized it, and it now began to, agencies like ICE and Border Patrol, they were under kind of more of a tighter grip, following federal policies. Now, the first time we ever saw anybody move to try to build any sort of a wall or have a conversation about some sort of barrier on a border was in 2006 with the Secure Fence Act. And that basically was the construction of a fence along the southern border. And then, of course, after that period of things happen, the deportations, the annual deportations became 250,000 annually. Now, as I've said before, you have to have laws. Every other country, you might just be out here like, oh yeah, Joseph, are you for like open borders and letting people in? No, I don't think we should just have this open border policy where we don't have laws, because that doesn't make sense. We have to have borders, just like every country has borders and laws and everything like that. I mean, Mexico's got tough immigration laws. I mean, there are tons of countries that do. But at the same time, when you, and I said this earlier, I'll say it again, when you have benefited from other people's labor and you have encouraged them to come in, you've reaped the benefits of the labor, you can't then at the same time try to push those same people out and then demonize them while doing so. That's corrupt, and it's unjust. And so that is something that, once again, it is important for us to have these laws in place. We need to look at our system and we need to redefine what it's going to look like. We need to redefine what the process will be. And also, what do we do with the people that have been contributing already? But at the same time, we cannot sit in this situation and just act like this is something that is happening and we have no control over it and we're not at fault. And so just continuing onward here, and this is something that I really want to just talk about very, very quickly. Of course, past this period of time, we had the economic downturn in 2008 and 2009, which has brought back this anti-immigrant sentiment. Undocumented workers were blamed for, quote, taking American jobs, same as back during the 1930s. But they made up 25% of the labor force in some industries. And these are, once again, jobs that a lot of people did not want to do. And now, because of economic challenges and shortages, now you have these people being used as a scapegoat. And this narrative, that video that I played for you earlier, where Trump was talking about that whole thing with these people coming into the country and we don't know where they're coming from, everything like that, this matches that narrative. And even under, President Obama, a lot of people have talked about this. There's a bit of a contrast here, because President Obama deported 3 million immigrants during his presidency, which was more than any previous president at the time. But on the other hand, he introduced DACA, which is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and it offered relief to 800,000 people who were brought to the United States as children. Now, it helped people in many ways, but the problem is that, and like I said, there's a lot of things that Obama did with this that were helpful, but it was very piecemeal in the sense that it offered a very, very temporary solution that another president could come in and completely either reverse or try to chip away at. And that's essentially, what happened under Trump. When he came in 2017, his policies were zero tolerance. Of course, we talked about I mentioned earlier the Remain in Mexico policy, but they separated families. They started building a border wall. And a lot of this conversation was about fear, exclusion. Of course, that video that we talked about, it doesn't talk about immigrants positively. It doesn't start off by saying, hey, we have a problem with immigration. We need to fix it, but we also need to be celebrative or celebratory rather of the fact that these people are helping to build the country, and draw a contrast between the people that have done damage and have committed crime, while at the same time saying the population of the folks that are doing good and that are helping the country is far higher than those that are doing the country harm. And so, once again, tens of thousands of asylum seekers were stranded in dangerous conditions. And even while all this stuff was going on during the Trump administration's first term, undocumented workers remained essential to the economy. And at the end of the day, there is an aspect of this that I look at and I say to myself, at what point do we continue to have a people that have contributed? And I feel like in some ways, as a black man, this is something that it affects me looking at it a little bit differently. Because I've heard these narratives, about, I've heard this from some of my fellow brothers and sisters in the community, where, the talks about the 14th Amendment and getting rid of birthright citizenship. I was on a TikTok live about a month ago or so, and it was pretty much like it was a lot of Black and Latino people having conversations on this live, but it was mostly from a Black creators page, and they were talking about like, what are your thoughts on the mass deportations and everything? And I was very disheartened and surprised to see a lot of Black people in that chat. And I know this doesn't represent all of our thoughts, but in that chat, there was a lot of, why do we care about Mexicans in this situation? It doesn't impact us. And, that no one's ever done anything for us and all this other stuff. And I get that sentiment because it feels very frustrating sometimes as a Black American to look at all the stuff that has happened. And yeah, socially we've made progress, and in some ways economically we've made progress, but there's been so much injustice done. And I think what bothers me looking at this is sometimes the way that I've heard the narrative be disengaged. Now, there have been issues between Mexicans and Black people in this country, and we could talk about that at another time. But this whole narrative of, oh, well, this is not affecting me, this isn't part of my life, what have they ever done for us? What about the quote when ML said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere? We have to stand up when we see these things impacting any community in this country. Because if you know anything about your history, the 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship, was first granted to us because there were those that would seek to keep us outside of the citizenship of this country after we labored and worked to build the wealth of this country. And after we were denied what we were promised with 40 acres and a mule and so on and so forth, that whole policy, the 14th Amendment, if they can come for that one thing, and if we successfully let that happen, they will begin to erode other laws and policies that impact us. So it's very, very important that we keep an eye on this and that we stand up for injustice wherever it is. Because if we don't do it when one person is affected or one group is affected, who will stand up for us when we're affected? And so just, kind of coming to an end here. Obviously, we know what's happening currently today. We've heard a lot about it. In this current term, Donald Trump has pretty much moved to undo everything that Joe Biden has done. In 2021, 1.7 million immigrants or migrants were encountered at the border. Of course, there was a need for comprehensive reform at that time. And a lot of people felt as though the Biden administration in some ways did not do enough to stop some of the expansion of crossings. There was, of course, a bill that was recommended in last year during the campaign, and the Trump or Donald Trump himself basically told Republicans not to get behind it because he wanted to run on this position and then pass his own bill. But what we're looking at right now is currently this administration has already moved on mass deportations. And that's not just for those that have criminal records, but that's also for people with minor offenses or no criminal history. This targets 2 million undocumented immigrants for deportation in the first year of this term. Now, will he be able to pull that off? You know, in the actual logistics of everything, we're not sure. But they have already moved to do this. I've had several conversations with people, families. In fact, someone will be coming on this program whose family has been directly affected by this situation. And there are so many people that are living in fear. The Remain in Mexico policy has been reinstated. The migrants are now being forced to wait in Mexico while their claims are being processed. And this is leading to overcrowded border camps and really health, humanitarian, sanitary concerns. And what we're looking at right now, this is not in the next 4 years, but by the middle of this year, over 70,000 migrants are stranded or will be stranded in Mexico under this policy. And of course, we already talked about the move to end birthright citizenship through executive orders and legal battles, which a lot of these grabs that we're seeing, these power grabs that we're seeing are completely un-American and unconstitutional. And so, as I mentioned before, what will happen as a result of this? Currently, immigrants contribute, I'm going to read some numbers. Immigrants contribute to $1.6 trillion in the U.S. economy every year. Mass deportation will lead to significant labor shortages in key industries. And if all undocumented workers are removed, the United States would lose 2.1 million jobs in agriculture, construction, and hospitality. Additionally, undocumented immigrants pay billions in taxes annually, including income, sales, and property taxes, and they contribute to the United States economy and Social Security, 11.7 billion state and local taxes every year, despite being ineligible to receive benefits. And you can read about that in the articles, The Economic Impact of Mass Deportation by the Center for American Progress and Undocumented Immigrants Pay Billions in Taxes by the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy. Now, the reason why I really want to talk about this is because at the end of the day, and we will obviously, I'll talk more about this when we have our guests come on. There's a lot of myths surrounding this. There's a lot of myths surrounding immigration, and we need to address them. I'm going to do it real quick here, but we need to tackle some of these myths. The first myth, and I talked about this a few seconds ago, but that undocumented immigrants don't pay taxes. That is a myth. The fact is that undocumented immigrants pay billions in taxes annually, including sales, property, and income taxes. And as I mentioned previously, they contribute $12 billion to Social Security while not being eligible for benefits. Imagine that. Imagine contributing so much and yet not even being able to be eligible for those benefits. And people are saying that you're taking benefits. Myth number two, immigrants take jobs away from Americans. Fact, immigrants often fill labor gaps in industries like agriculture, construction, and hospitality. And currently, undocumented workers account for 25% of U.S. agricultural labor, which once again is work a lot of Americans don't typically either want to do or would not do unless they were paid a reasonable wage, which would just increase the cost of goods. Number three, myth. Immigrants are a drain on public resources. Here's the fact. Immigrants contribute more in taxes than they use in public services, and undocumented immigrants are ineligible for most federal benefits. And perhaps this might be the biggest myth of all that was propagated during the Trump first administration, the campaign, and even in this current one. Immigrants increase crime rates. The fact is that immigrants, including undocumented ones, are less likely to commit crimes than native-born Americans because with the policies in place, even if it's a traffic infraction, such as speeding or doing an improper turn, you can literally, if you break any of those laws, you can be either put under more scrutiny or you can even be sent home or sent back to where you came from. The penalties are stricter. What we really need to talk about with this situation is why so many people, with all these false narratives that are happening, why these people still keep coming to America when the environment currently seems to be very hostile and very negative towards people that are coming looking for a better life. And many of these people are fleeing gang violence, they're fleeing drug cartels, political instability, poverty, natural disasters. In 2021, 70% of migrants from Central America cited violence and poverty as their reasons for trying to come to America. Now, we do have to fix the problem. We do have to have strong enforcement of our laws. I do believe that. But we need to have a comprehensive plan. We need to have one that if you've lived in this country and you've worked in this country and you've contributed to this country, you need to get a pathway to citizenship that makes sense. We need to fix our broken immigration system. We need to make it simpler for people to actually enter into a program and go through a process of coming into this country and doing so legally, while also honoring and taking care of the folks that have been here and that have worked. And then we need to have a technologically sound, humane process that instead of just using weapons and inhumane practices, we can use technology and we can use, I'm not against border patrol and enforcement, but we need to have more empathy and we need to have more compassion in the way we go about doing this, while at the same time using technology to root out the causes of people crossing illegally, while also addressing and creating a partnership between Central American countries to not only build economic connections and blocks, but to also make sure that we are taking care of these people and establishing a basis for expansion of economic opportunity, not the dwindling. We're going to talk about this a little bit more next time when I bring on the guest that'll be coming onto the show. I want to thank you for your time today. If you have not subscribed to us or if you're not following us, go ahead and do so at Full Circle Pod on Instagram. That's all the time I have for today. Thank you very much. And I look forward to continuing this conversation because we got work to do. Let's be a part of the solution. Until next time, have a great one from your favorite brother. Peace.